same time as everyone is thinking about Children's Mental Health Week. You've just heard the little Zoom person reminding us that we're recording the session today, and we're doing that so that we can make sure that volunteers who weren't able to be with us are able to catch up with the recording. So I've introduced myself already to those of you who joined us nice and early, but if you are just joining us, my name's Emma Bell. I'm the CEO of Chapter One, and our expert speaker today is Olivia Richards. So Olivia is a very experienced teacher who has always had an interest in wellbeing and literacy. So she started out as an English teacher, and her career has developed as a teacher, but also as a lead practitioner for wellbeing in a variety of different schools in the south of England. And she's also been able to travel to different countries, notably the US and Canada, to think about how different cultures and societies are using reading and writing to improve children and young people's mental health. So in the last few years, she's established an independent organisation called the Story Project, which is really about trying to promote how the magic of stories can enhance social and emotional skills in young people. And that's the guise in which I met her last year. And I'm very excited that she's been able to create this session for us today, which will talk in general terms about how stories can support well-being, but we'll also use an example of a story on the Chapter One platform to really help you as volunteers think about how you can use some of the content in your reading sessions with children and really expand the discussion with them so that you're helping build their confidence, their sense of self, and all those things which are very important to their mental health. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Olivia, who's going to take us through the session today. And as I say, please keep yourselves on mute and put any questions that you have in the chat. Olivia will be pausing to get your feedback at various points. Thanks. Over to you, Olivia. Olivia, I think you might be on mute.
Oh, thank you. Thanks so much, Emma. It's so lovely to be here today and to be speaking with all the fantastic Chapter One volunteers. Like Emma said, I am very passionate about the use of stories to improve children's wellbeing, which comes from my experience as a teacher, my work with the Story Project, which is training teachers for how they can get the most out of stories in terms of improving children's wellbeing, but also the research that Emma mentioned internationally, but also I'm doing a PhD looking at how stories can improve children's wellbeing. And I'm really excited to use my experience and my research to share some practical ideas for how you can also use your experience as Chapter One volunteers to help support children's wellbeing. So hopefully you can see the screen. Let me just put that full. Yeah, can you all see that? So
yep, Olivia, that's great, thank you. Yeah.
So I wanted to start by sharing this quote with you. Some of you might be familiar with this, but it's from Roald Dahl's story Matilda. So Matilda's strong young mind continued to grow, nurtured by the voices of all those authors who had sent their books out into the world like ships on the sea. These books gave Matilda a hopeful and comforting message. You are not alone. Obviously, as Chapter One volunteers, you are opening these worlds for young people by giving them the skills to be able to read and access books themselves. But also, through sharing stories, you're providing this hopeful and comforting message and showing children that they're not alone. Now, I particularly chose this story because this is a book that I read a lot when I was younger, one of my favourite books. It was read to me and really helped me to learn these messages around my well-being when I was feeling anxious. That feeling that I was not alone was really comforting to me. But also, as I started to read myself, I continued to read this book a lot. So I think this story really impacted a lot on my well-being, from the perspective of kind of that message of you're not alone. I just wondered if anybody wanted, before we sort of go into looking at the chapter 1 stories, does anybody have any experiences themselves of stories that have really impacted on your well-being? So it might be a story that you read a lot when you were younger. It might be a story that you've read recently, as an adult, that you think had a really, positive message around well-being. Or it might be something you've read with your own children or with children that you know. Would anybody just like to put in the chat in the names of any stories that you've come across that are that have supported your well-being? I don't know if Becky, if you can see the chat, are there any suggestions in there of stories? Or
And I think everybody's thinking mode at the moment, so I am too. So I think, yeah, here we go. We've got some. So Lynn is saying, I love stories that took me into a different place as an only child. Yeah, I can relate to that, Lynn. I was effectively an only child. I used to be crazy about reading pony stories. That was my big escape.
Fantastic. Oh, lots of ideas. Oh, I love it. Pippi Longstockings. I'm starting to see it myself as well, Becky. Some really popular ones here. The Winnie the Pooh.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, brilliant. Some other Roald Dahl fans. I love that. Ordinary Princess. Oh, that's one I don't know. I'm going to have to look that one up. I love The Worst Witch as well. So it's really nice to hear your thoughts around this and some of the stories that you really enjoyed reading yourselves. And I guess that's kind of the first message when we're thinking about well-being and reading. It's that usually, we do have those stories that we can think of ourselves and connect with. So thank you for sort of sharing those. And I guess once now we've sort of connected with our own experiences, let's have a look at some of the research around this. So there's a lot of evidence out there of the link between reading and well-being. So the National Literacy Trust has got a lot of data around this. Children who are the most engaged with literacy are 3 times more likely to have higher levels of mental well-being than children who are the least engaged. Those who have low verbal ability having worse mental health outcomes than those with higher verbal ability. 3 in 5 children and young people saying that reading helps them relax, and nearly 1 in 2 children saying reading makes them feel happy. So before we even kind of look at any ways to enhance what we're doing already with chapter 1 and encouraging children to read, we know that actually simply giving children the skill to be able to read is having a massive impact on their mental well-being, because they have that ability to escape, like a lot of us did through the books that we've already shared in the chat, through reading. So we're opening those worlds for children just by giving them reading skills. But also, there's been a lot of research coming out around the real importance of children having people to read with regularly, and not just one person that they read with, but the Book Trust did some research talking about reading influencers and the importance that children have the opportunity to read with multiple people. And they actually found that 31% of children age 0 to 7 do not regularly read with multiple people. So obviously the work that you're doing as a chapter 1 volunteer is providing children with that opportunity to read regularly with different people, but also to obviously help improve their reading ability, which means they can read to enjoy it, which will help their well-being. But also, I guess, something that's worth flagging and sounds a bit obvious, but by having the reading skills, reading opens the whole curriculum. I'm sure that you've heard this mentioned before, but to be able to achieve in any subject, children need those literacy skills. So to be able to have the full opportunities in life and live a life with positive well-being, having better reading skills is really opening that. So what you're doing already is really championing children's well-being, which is really exciting. Thank you, Becky, for sharing that report. So what we're going to talk about today is, on top of what we're already doing, just simply by helping children to learn how to read and being a reading influencer, we're going to look at some other ways, maybe some small tips or ideas for questions that can help in our one-to-one sessions to even enhance how stories help children's well-being. So we're going to look at these 4 different areas today. The chance for stories to comfort, nurture and connect, the way that we can use stories to improve vocabulary around well-being. We're going to look at a theory related to the story laboratory, which sounds very exciting, and it is a really interesting concept. And then also, you might have heard of the phrase of stories as mirrors and windows and doors. So we're going to look at that in a bit more detail. Like Becky said at the beginning, if anybody does have any questions as we go along, please do add those to the chat. Becky's going to be kind of monitoring that for me. So feel free to ask questions as we go along, but we'll also stop between the various points to see if there's any questions too. So before we talk about these 4 different areas, we thought it would be helpful to really link this with a chapter 1 story, because obviously the stories that you're reading with the children in chapter 1 are helping children who maybe have a low reading ability. So sometimes you might be thinking, in terms of supporting children's well-being, the language is quite simple. So how can you kind of use a really simple story, but still to build children's well-being? So we're going to read a chapter 1 story together and then talk about specifically for that story, how you could, what kind of questions you could ask to enhance children's well-being. We'll also at the end share a PDF with kind of those types of questions written on it that can be applied to any chapter 1 story, and any story, you know, if you want to use these skills, obviously, at home or with other children that you know. So let's look at this story. Some of you might have read this before with one of your children that you worked with. It's actually a really lovely story. So it's called A Day with Aunt Lola. "Take my hand," says Aunt Lola. "It's time to go. Aunt Lola and I like to walk all around the city." "Where are we going?" I ask. "You will find out soon," says Lola, "but I will give you some clues." "The place we're going is somewhere we have been before," says Lola. "Is it the shop?" I ask. "No," says Lola, "it's not the shop." "Here's another clue. The place we're going is somewhere people are quiet," says Lola. "Is it the cinema?" I ask. "No," says Lola, "it's not the cinema." "Here's another clue. The place we're going is somewhere where there are lots of books," says Lola. "Is it the library?" I ask. "Yes," says Lola. And here we are. Aunt Lola and I skip up the steps to the library. It is fun to have a day out with Aunt Lola. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed that story. Actually really lovely content in there. Lots of different emotions about feeling excited. But I guess the first thing that we want to talk about is how stories can enhance children's well-being simply because they are a comforting and nurturing experience, and they give children the opportunity to connect with someone else. So thinking about how we can kind of enhance that in our one-to-one sessions, just quite simply asking the children before we get started, are you comfortable? Like, this is a story time experience. You know, we think about kind of story time, maybe reading with an adult when we were a child and how comforting that was. Children can really get that out of your one-to-one sessions just by showing that we care how they're feeling and how they are they comfortable when they're reading this story. Shall we take a deep breath before we get started? So you might notice with your the children that you're working with, maybe they're feeling really excitable, or maybe their mind is wandering because they've come from something else. Just a really simple thing, taking a deep breath before we get started, with the idea that we're encouraging them to kind of relax their nervous system, kind of escape from whatever's been happening before. Just even if you do it yourself right now, just a really slow breath. You immediately feel more relaxed doing that. I really like doing that midway through a presentation because it also relaxes me and makes me talk a little bit slower. But at the start of a reading session, or if you feel like a child's getting, you know, maybe a bit excitable, that can be a really nice thing to do. Just asking questions such as, how do you feel about reading today? So maybe they're excited about it, maybe they're a bit nervous, and based on their answer, you can kind of try and match that energy or give them some reassurance about you know, the session. Like, if they are feeling a bit nervous, obviously we want to encourage the children to be doing the reading, but you might say, well, why don't I read the first page, or something like that, to get them kind of started. Or you might say, oh, don't worry, I was a bit nervous today as well, because I had to do something, you know, I had to talk at work, or just kind of something to kind of help them with that. And if they're excited, then obviously matching that energy and really, well, if they're too excited, helping them calm down. But if they are feeling looking forward to it, kind of showing that you're really looking forward to it too. How do you feel about this book? Just that's that connection, isn't it? Asking them what they feel about it. And then particularly for this book, after we've read it, you might be trying to connect with them about the content in the book. So have you ever been to the library, seeing if they've got those shared experiences? Maybe for me, I would be saying, you know, I'm excited about this book because I love going to the library with my niece, and kind of sharing a little bit of opportunity to connect around the story. No matter what the content is, if there's a character in there or an animal or something, there must be an opportunity to provide some connection. And then I guess that tip around thinking about tone of voice and how you can make the story as engaging as possible. So obviously, if the children are reading and they're learning to read, they might not be able to put tone of voice into while they're reading, if they're really struggling to decode the different words. So, you know, if they're kind of reading the story, but it is fun, they're maybe not getting to experience the excitement of the story or the feelings in the story. So it might be that you, obviously ensuring that they have the opportunity to read is the most important thing, but you might read a page for them, adding in some of that tone of voice and just helping them to feel that the story is engaging, and that sort of helps create that connection around the story. So that's kind of one area that you might be thinking about when you're thinking about your one-to-one sessions and supporting children's well-being. And I guess it's really important as well, isn't it, when we think about some of the children who might not have the opportunity to read at home, this is their real time for that comfort and nurture around stories. The next area that we might be able to enhance children's well-being through the one-to-one sessions is through emotional vocabulary. So you might, one of the things that really underpins children's ability to be able to regulate their emotions or to be able to understand their emotions is children really need the words to describe their emotions. They need to recognize how emotions look and how they feel. And this is something that is often a real challenge for young people, especially children who are struggling with their mental health. That can often sometimes be linked back to the fact that they struggle to express their emotions. So one of the things in the story project that we really try to emphasize is trying to support children's emotional vocabulary and build children's emotional vocabulary. So some sort of questions that you might ask to do this is, how do you think the child in the story is feeling? So obviously she's maybe a bit confused, she doesn't know where she's going, or she's surprised that it's the library. Trying to encourage children to think about that, not just kind of read the story and move on, but thinking about how the characters are feeling. How do you think Aunt Lola is feeling? And then a really important question, how do you know? How do you know? So if you have a child, basically one of the most important things is thinking about if they can tell you how a character is feeling, but how do you know that they're feeling that way? Can they look at some evidence in the pictures in the story that tells you how the character is feeling? So if they're saying that maybe Aunt Lola is feeling excited, you know, she has a big smile on her face. That's one of the ways that we know she's, you know, we can put ourselves in Aunt Lola's shoes. She must be excited because she's on this day out with her niece. So that might be a question to ask. And then again, coming back to that connection or helping the children to explore their own emotions. Have you ever felt that way? And sharing maybe a time when I felt excited when my friend surprised me by visiting for my birthday, or, you know, obviously thinking of your own examples. And can you think of any other words to describe that feeling? So these are just a few sort of things to think about in terms of enhancing that emotional vocabulary understanding. And then you might ask children to demonstrate their understanding of an emotion by showing the related emotion in their tone of voice. So when the child is kind of asking where they're going, how could they ask that question in an excited way? So if we were saying, like, where are we going? You know, that might show that they're more excited. And obviously through the way that the chapter 1 sessions take place, voice and tone of voice is really important, isn't it? So it's a really great opportunity for children to practice that, because quite often we do show our emotions through our faces and body language, but it's quite rare that actually children get the chance to practice their emotions through their tone of voice. So that might be a really nice opportunity. I can just see a couple of questions in the chat, so this might be a nice place to start. So this is definitely a challenge when my student is concentrating hard on the individual words. I wonder how much sense of the actual story she gets. It can also be difficult to gauge emotions with no visual cues. Yeah, really good point there. And I think that comes back to that, letting the child obviously have that opportunity to read the story themselves, but also creating your own excitement around it by maybe summing up the story for the child, or asking questions that sort of encourage the child to think about what the story means. Or if it's a particularly short story, you might you know, take time to read a little bit of it. I like this comment by Rachel as well. My son is the same. I try to quickly recap each page as we go, which does help a bit. But at this age, it does feel like he's more focused on the actual words than the content, which, you know, obviously them learning the actual words is really important, and that is helping them learn to read so they can access this type of content in the future. But if they are just focused on the words, you can see why children might lose interest in reading or lose the excitement about it. So having this opportunity, like Kathy said, to briefly discuss what was going on, really helps. And that's really interesting. Adding tone of voice can be quite embarrassing for the reader. Good idea to demonstrate it first. Yeah, I find that sort of the more silly that I can be, can be, or just sort of exaggerated in my tone of voice, can help the children to feel more confident doing themselves. Or just asking them to try the tone of voice for one word, or maybe who can do the most excited tone of voice, making it a bit of a competition, might make the children feel like it's a bit more of a game, which could be quite fun. And Emma, we always find that it's important to give children time to think a bit before they respond to questions. So learning to pause once you've asked something, which can be hard to do. That's such a good point, isn't it? Because the children might need that time to think about it, or if they're not responding, maybe they have missed some of the context of the story. So you might go back and point them to, so if you're asking them, how do you think the child is feeling, or you might go back to the page which shows really clearly how the child was feeling. You might go to the page and sort of point out, she's got a big smile on her face, how do you think she's feeling? And then you can sort of open the conversation about it. But that, obviously, I can imagine that patience is such an important part, and one of the skills that you guys will be really good at with the sort of one-to-one reading that you do, because you will have to be patient and let children have the chance to read things themselves. So having that sort of patience when they're asking the questions can be really helpful for children. So those are just, a few ideas, and it sounds like things that you've been really thinking about already with your volunteering, which is really exciting. So hopefully it just kind of gives you a bit of some more ideas of how to build it in. Is this, my reader is very chatty. I find that if we pause at the end of a page to mention something, she tends to go off track with a full-blown conversation, which stops the flow of the story. Any tips on this? Should I just wait until the end of the book? That's brilliant, isn't it? That they're so chatty, and they obviously really value having that time with you, and they really enjoy it. You can tell that by how chatty they are. I think, you could say to them, let's enjoy the story first, and we'll try and read through it, and then shall we save our questions to the end? Or you could, say, let's read 3 pages and then we'll have a chat, and kind of make it really clear to the child that they will get that opportunity to have the chat. They will get the opportunity to have the conversation. You're really excited about that too, but you want to make sure that they get to enjoy the story too, because I guess what we want to make sure is that they're not just trying to avoid the reading part of it. We want them to feel also that that's really important, and that you really value that part of it too. So it might be that you kind of, say, sure, I'm so excited to see what's going to happen in the story. Let's read to the end of the story, or let's find out what happens to this part, then let's talk about it, or something like that, just so they've kind of got those clear expectations as well. But some really fantastic questions, everyone. Did anybody else have any other questions they wanted to, or any comments that they wanted to share before we go to have a look at the other sort of tips? Thank you, Bonnie. So comprehension factor can be quite difficult when the readers aren't as confident or are focusing a lot on getting the words correct. Yeah, and that is such a big part of reading. That is really important. Like, the children are in that stage where they are decoding the stories. So that's it's really important that they have that opportunity to get the words correct. But maybe there are there's sort of that separation, isn't there? Giving them the opportunity to do that, but then also asking the questions afterwards, and having the patience to let them try getting the words correct, but also giving them that time afterwards to ask questions, or to go back and sort of summarize the story. I really like Debbie's point as well. I often get the child to look at the pictures first and tell me what she thinks is going to happen before we start reading. So that might be, even that front cover of the story, thinking about what you think is going to happen, getting them excited, which also helps with the decoding, doesn't it? Because decoding and learning to read is about learning the different letters, but it's also taking in the context of the story and then being able to guess what's sort of happening as they go along. So I think looking at the pictures first is a really good idea. And sometimes looking at the pictures as well, first, to see what the different emotions of the characters are as well, sort of talking about that before you've even started might just be a really nice way to sort of set the tone that you kind of care about these characters, and that they are, even though the stories are quite basic, these are really, these are characters that we can feel invested in, that we can feel excited about. So thank you for that, Debbie. James, so I've not currently started my reading sessions yet, waiting to be paired with the child. So, that's great to hear. Thanks, James. Interesting. I find that when the children are reading to me, they don't pause at the full stop and advice. Yeah, so that is something that children really need to learn, about the punctuation. That is a challenge that I've seen, even with secondary age children, and especially if they don't use full stops in their own writing, they tend not to notice it in what they are reading. So sometimes it might be making a point of that. We're going to really look out for the full stops, and what we're going to do is we're going to take a deep breath at every full stop just to really point that out. There was a really fun game that might not work over video, but just kind of gives you an idea of sort of how we might do this in the classroom, where when we were reading, we'd do like punctuation kung fu. So the children would have to sort of do like a punch whenever there was a full stop, or yeah, if there was a comma. So we can't sort of do that physical thing if we can't see the children, but you can say, right, every time there's a full stop, let's take a deep breath and just really draw their attention to it. Because if anything, if that's the thing that they get out of the reading session, that they sort of stop at full stops, that's really going to help their literacy and their reading skills. Lots of great comments on Debbie's comment, and Jane saying she does that too. It gets my people really interested to see what we think will happen if it does or does not, which is that connection, isn't it? That's brilliant. Helps to understand how they think, and interpret what's coming. Brilliant. The question mark is always one to flag too. Yeah, definitely. So yes, they will have been learning it at this stage. So they'll start in year 1 learning basic punctuation. But like I said, depending on their literacy skills, they'll be at different stages with sort of their understanding of this. And it is, especially as we get into those question marks and exclamation marks, it is, a more developed skill. So the children that you're working with, if they are struggling with their literacy, then they probably are struggling with those sort of basic punctuation marks. I think even at secondary school, it's still something that the children can struggle with. So thank you for those questions. Brilliant. Right, I'll share some other slides, but obviously feel free to keep the questions coming in, because we'll stop again to sort of look at those. Right, so the story laboratory. So a really interesting sort of theory that I've come across in my research, the term story laboratory was coined by someone called Kevin Oatley, and he's particularly looking at the use of stories to improve people's mental health and well-being. And the idea is that children can experience life situations through a story before they actually experience them in real life. So stories are kind of like a little practice example of a social situation before we experience that social situation in real life. So that's why it's called a laboratory. So for the example of this story, we can go enter the story laboratory of being surprised and not knowing what's going to happen, and think about, through the story's example, how would we react in that situation before we're maybe in that situation in real life. So this can be really important for children's well-being, just having the opportunity to talk through some of these life situations, but in a really low stakes context. So you're not actually putting them in a situation where they're surprised and, you know, they're kind of having to deal with on their feet, how should I react to this? But you're just using the story as an opportunity to talk about some of life situations that can affect our well-being. So for this story, it might be, how would you react if Lola didn't tell you where she was going? Like, how would you react in that situation? And again, it's giving the children time to think about it. It's creating that connection between you and the child as you sort of think about this situation together. Would you be able to keep the library a surprise like Aunt Lola did? So, you know, if you knew that you were taking someone on a day out, or that if you knew that your parents were taking you on a day out, but your sister didn't know, would you be able to keep it a surprise? That kind of question, just getting them to think about these potential real life situations, but through the experiences of the characters. And then, you know, for me, I might say, if I was in Aunt Lola's shoes, I'd want to tell my niece straight away. I find surprises quite hard. I'd be really excited, so I'd maybe want to tell them straight away. But you can kind of talk about then the benefits or the not benefits of keeping it a surprise, and did it, you know, did that make a big difference to the child if it was a surprise? And, you know, just asking them, do you like surprises? Again, that connection. But because we're talking about the story and the characters, you know, it's a low stakes conversation. We're not kind of asking the children to talk about their own well-being in detail, but we are talking about the characters' reactions or relationships, which helps children to sort of understand their own relationships and reactions better. Now, this also obviously has an impact on children's connection with the story, their literacy, because it's helping them with their comprehension, helping them to think about the story from a different perspective, from those characters' perspective, which is a skill that children really need to learn to be able to understand what they're reading, but also to, you know, develop that sort of love for reading. And I guess the tip here is just, there's no right or wrong answers, you know, that it's like I said, low stakes, just letting the children have the opportunity to explore how they'd react in different scenarios. So if they're not sure, obviously that's absolutely fine, but it's just kind of opening the conversation, maybe sharing, even you just sharing in a quick one sentence, if I were in Aunt Lola's shoes, I'd want to tell my niece straight away. Simply saying that is giving the child your experience of that situation. It's just giving the child a chance to think about how other people might react in this situation and bringing that story to life. So I hope that makes sense, that story laboratory, but it's something that I find really interesting. You might have heard of the term vicarious learning, where we don't just learn things by doing things ourselves, we also learn by seeing others do things. And through the research that I've been doing with my PhD, in terms of children developing their well-being through stories, that concept of vicarious learning and learning through others is something that really has come up time and time again. Let me just check the chat if there's anything. Yeah, so really interesting. I have to practice not asking closed questions, otherwise I just get a yes or no. Yeah, that's really hard, isn't it, Tanya? Just having a think if there's any of those open questions that we can ask, giving the opportunity for children to explore, or building, if we have asked a closed question, you know, do you think the child enjoyed the library? If they say yes or no, you know, why do you think that? Or giving your perspective, helping them to see it from your point of view, and then saying, you know, what about you? And Bonnie's raised a good point as well. Often the children are bilingual, so they're differentiating between the two. Yeah, such a challenge, isn't it? And so amazing that the children are able to do that, and speak multiple languages. So that is something that we need to take on board as well. And sometimes sharing that context of the story is even more important if the children are bilingual, because if they can, you know, understand what's happening in the story or looking at those pictures, then it might be easier for them to sort of put that into context in their own language, and then you know, practice kind of communicating that back in English. But that is something, again, you know, we just have to be patient, and we do have to recognise that all the children have different challenges, and not all of these tips are going to apply to every child. But it's just things to have in your back pocket, depending on the child that you're working with. But yeah, thank you for that. Okay. Now, you might have heard this concept before. It's really important and really been shared a lot. It was originally coined by Rudine Sims Bishop, and she talked about the concept of stories as mirrors, windows, and doors. So in the stories that children read, they have the opportunity to see themselves, so through the mirror. So that might be, they see that, you know, going back to that quote right at the beginning, you are not alone, there's other people like you who do similar things to you, or who like similar things to you, or look the same as you. And it's important that children do see themselves through the stories that we choose, or that we read. So having children have the opportunity to see themselves in the stories, or connect with their own experiences with the characters in the stories, is really important. And there's a lot of work. I know that chapter 1 do ensure that the stories that they have on their platform show a diverse range of characters, but also there's a lot of work going on in the children's publishing industry around making sure that there are diverse books available. If you have heard of the CLPE, so Children's Literacy and Primary Education, they release a report every year called Reflecting Realities, which talks about sort of representation in the children's publishing industry. So it's a great place to go for sort of recommendations of books, in terms of if you're thinking outside of your volunteering experience. But inside your volunteering experience, obviously it's thinking about helping children to make those connections with the characters, making sure that if you're working with that child, obviously over a long period of time, you'll get to see what types of books the children are choosing. So have they chosen a book that, you know, are they choosing books that do let them see themselves in the story? That might be something that you'll kind of become more aware of. Then books as windows is also the idea that also through stories we get that opportunity to see worlds that we've never seen before. We get the opportunity to learn about characters that we don't, and things that we don't know about. We get the opportunity to see that people experience life in different ways to us, and that might be as simply as, you know, we're reading a story about underwater creatures and we never heard of one of the fish before, you know, something like that. Or it might be that we look at a story that's you know, from a different gender perspective, or from a different sort of, you know, has different characters represented in terms of age or race, but making sure that children see other people represented in the stories that they read. Oh, thanks, Becky. She shared the report that I mentioned. Oh, sorry. So that's what the mirrors and windows are. Then also I liked this part of books as doors, because also books can open doors, because they might show us an opportunity that we didn't know about. So maybe there's a character who's doing a job that we've not heard about, or there's a place in a story that we didn't know about, but suddenly we're available, you know, that's a place where we can visit when we're older, or we can become interested in. So it's really, you know, we've talked a lot today about the power of stories, but I think thinking about it in terms of mirrors and windows and doors just also helps us to think, you know, what are the children kind of getting out of this story in terms of representation? And when you're with your the child that you're working with, it might be, shall we choose a book about something we don't know about today? So if you're finding they are choosing the same kind of stories each session, maybe there's a challenge there that we're trying to look for something that we don't know about today. Or shall we choose a book about a topic we love today, letting them have that mirror opportunity? And then it might be, with the story that we're reading, encouraging the children to think about that story from different perspectives, and encouraging them to think, you know, would all children experience this situation in the same way? So do you think all children would be happy to go to the library? Who would or wouldn't? And that might just encourage them to think about why some people like the library, some people don't, and that's okay. But it's kind of just getting them to think beyond their own experience. Yeah, how old do you think the child is in the story? How do you know? How would an older or younger child react? Maybe getting them to think about from a specific perspective. Maybe they, you know a younger child or an older child, and they might bring their perspective into it. So it's just encouraging children to think about the story from different perspectives, and to choose books featuring a range of characters if possible. Obviously, I know that the most important thing is thinking about children's, you know, what sort of level that they're reading at in terms of the volunteering experience, but there still is a lot of variation in the stories that are offered. So it might be, you know, within the opportunities that are there, sort of thinking what, you know, getting the child to really think about what story they're choosing. And then obviously outside of your volunteering experience, if you are reading with a young person, your own child or other children that you know, what stories do they have access to? Do they have books that are mirrors? Do they have books that are windows, books that are doors? Something that I sort of noticed, which is one of those things which is sort of unconscious. When I looked at the stories I was kind of picking in terms of for my class, I noticed that a lot of them had female protagonists. I think maybe because there haven't always been stories with female protagonists, so it kind of was maybe me overcompensating or just sort of relating to those better myself. But I had to make sure, obviously, when I was reading with the whole class, that I had to be really aware of that when I was choosing stories. So we've got some good questions coming in. Let's have a look at some of these questions, and then keep those sort of coming as well. So the 30-minute session goes so fast, I'm still trying to find the best way to balance the time. By the time we start the call, have a quick chat, do the flashcards, and then get on to the story. The session is almost halfway through. I don't like to cut off conversation when my reader is talking about the story, etc. And I also like to have a few minutes wind down time to say goodbye, etc. Towards the end of the session, I feel like I'm sometimes trying to rush things along. Are there any tips on how to manage this better, please? This is something that I've found all the time when teaching. You'd get really into something and then it'd be break time, or I've done like one-to-one sessions myself with children, and it was always the case. One of the things that I have found helpful, like it's still a challenge, is setting out with the child, what we're going to do today. So, and sort of talking them through the different stages, maybe at various points. Like, so if something's going on too long, to say, we want to make sure that we've got time for our story, or we want to make sure that we've got time for our questions at the end. And even just as the person leading the session, sometimes when I was working one-to-one, I'd have like a little timer. Obviously the children won't be able to see that, but you could use it for your own benefit of kind of being aware of what the time is and kind of planning out how much time you do want for the different sessions. So that might be something that you kind of think about. obviously you're mentioning sort of the flashcards, and that's something that sort of Lynn has found as well. So I don't know, I think maybe Emma or Becky might be in a better position to sort of say how long needs to be spent on the flashcards, or can you sort of vary that between different sessions? I'll leave that over to you guys if that's okay. Did any of you want to jump in with that?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in there, Olivia. I think yes, the new flashcards are indeed have a whole wealth of information, don't they, Lynn? I think the advice we would give is not to feel like you've got to do everything. You know, you can just dip in. Flashcards are really popular with some children, and they work as a really nice icebreaker, often to build confidence and to get a session started. But in any of the sort of, you know, the primary purpose of what you're doing is engaging in stories. So, you know, you might find children who don't respond to them particularly well, or a child whose reading is either too low or too high to really get much benefit from the flashcards. So don't feel like you have to do them. And if you do them, you can make them quick. And I think the thing, you know, Livia's given such a wealth of options here in terms of the kinds of questions that you might ask children. But similarly, don't feel like you've got to ask them all of these questions every single time. You know, you know, we don't want to pepper children with questions. We want the sessions to be organic and responsive to them and their thoughts and feelings as well. So these are, you know, these are all ideas, in the same way that how you choose to structure your session needs to be tailored both to how comfortable you feel and the needs of your individual pupil.
Thanks, Emma. I think that's a really good point, isn't it? And you might, if you notice that your sessions are very heavy with the flashcards after a few times, you might try something different. Like, I guess it's keeping that balance of the different things between the different sessions. Like, I love with chapter 1 that you do get the opportunity to work with the child again sometimes. So also it might be that giving the child a bit of choice in the matter could work well. Obviously we're coming towards the end of the time. I think we've got a few minutes left. I'm just thinking, is there anything I've not picked up? Staying at an easier reading level so you can pick all the good interactive stuff up without being stretched by the words. Again, I think, like Emma said, it is a balance, isn't it? And it's working out what feels more comfortable for you both. You know, we don't want to hold them back in terms of their reading. So if you can sort of enable them to have that stretch, like, they might get a bit bored if they're constantly at the easier level. So yeah, that's just a quick note on that, but I'm sure Emma or Becky would be able to follow that up. And then I like a little tip there from Claire about using the flashcards to make it into a game. That's fantastic. It sounds really good. Oh, well, thank you so much, everyone. I'm very pleased that we sort of managed to fit this all into time. And I'll, you know, what I wanted to share with you as well, these are my details. So if anybody does want to follow up, like, obviously you have such fantastic support from chapter 1, but I'm more than happy if anybody wants to ask about anything like this, or if you want to know more about the story project, obviously we have our website, Instagram and Twitter. So, you know, great to sort of keep connected with you all, and just, yeah, it's so exciting what you're all doing and making such a big difference to children's literacy and wellbeing. So happy to be involved. Thank you.